Right, good morning, dear students. I've got a huge task this morning as I sit here ready to make this recording. I'm going to be looking at the Victorian period, which is a very long period in British history. It goes from 1830 to 1901, so over 70 years of history. And of course, the Victorian period is called after Queen Victoria, who you see here, possibly the most famous monarch in British history. Here she is with her husband, Prince Albert. He was a prince because he was not of the British royal family. He was a prince from Germany. Now, a lot of us look back at the Victorian period and we think to ourselves that people were very old-fashioned, that people were very uptight. But I want to instead let you see the Victorian period as a period of incredible change. It's a period when London becomes the most important city in Europe, probably the most important city in the world. The population of London goes from 2 to 6 million. There's a massive movement from the countryside to towns, and this causes industrialization. There's a huge increase of wealth, and also Britain becomes easily the greatest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen. And as I want to stress today, Victorian people saw their age and looked at their age with a lot of anxiety because they saw it as an age of technological change and advances, very different from the way, as I said, that we see it today. Now, Queen Victoria is synonymous with the Victorian era. That means that the Victorian era is absolutely called after her. She exemplifies many of the Victorian characteristics that we speak of today. Earnestness, that means very serious, very moral, and a very strong belief in domestic propriety, which means staying at home and being a family person. Nevertheless, as I said, the Victorian age was an age of transition, and it was also an age in which people felt great moral seriousness. So it's an age of charity, religion, and missionary work, as you'll see. Now, the Victorian family is really interesting because it was a time of very strong male control, and we could call this the paterfamilias in Latin, or a patriarchal family. So the husband, the father, was very much the head of the family, and the wife's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband. Whilst the husband's major role in life was to earn money, a wife's place was to support her husband and tend to the children and to the domestic sphere, the home sphere. Here we can see a very famous Victorian painting of Queen Elizabeth and Albert. Now, what's quite interesting is even though she's the Queen, you will notice that he's sitting down and in many ways is the more commanding presence. You have the ideal child. You have the dogs and the wonderful home. You have this sense in which the home is a magical space. So this is going to be very important to the whole Victorian idea of the family. Here is another picture of women in the domestic sphere. Now, a phrase that you'll come across quite often is the idea of household angels. Women were seen, their greatest purpose in life was to spread moral goodness. And therefore, there was a huge pressure on women never to sin and be bad in any kind of sense. Here is a very famous poem by a poet called Coventry Patmore, a Victorian poet, written in 1854, in which he talks about a woman as a domestic angel. She loves with love that cannot tire, and when our woe she loves alone, through passionate duty love springs higher, as grass grows taller round a stone. In other words, a woman's job is to love her husband even after death. So as I say, this was absolutely key to understanding the way the Victorians saw gender roles. I included this photo because I thought you'd find it quite funny, that the Victorian era was the age of the beard, the age of whiskers, the age of sideburns. Male hair was in many ways symbolic of maleness. And therefore, I wanted you to see that this idea of very strong masculinity was the Victorian idea, and the opposite of that was the very frail, sensitive, moral, high purpose of women, femininity. However, in some ways, then, we've said the Victorians are very traditional in terms of their conceptions of the roles of men and women. But they were really go-ahead people who made new inventions and who changed the world possibly more than any other era. And I'm going to start off with the train, the steam train. Now, today it's very hard for us to understand just how revolutionary this was. And in 1830, we saw the first ever railway between Liverpool and Manchester. Those are two very, very key Victorian cities. Liverpool was the largest port in the world, and Manchester was the largest textile manufacturing city in the world. So these two northern towns were absolutely central to understanding Victorianism, okay? Now, over the course of the 19th century, that's the 1800s, more and more railways connect Britain. And that means that people can move around a great deal. It also means that people can work and live a long way from where they work. And so you have the beginnings of commuters, people who get on the train and go to work every day. It also means that you can transport goods from around the country so that you can get fresh cream in London and Manchester from the farms that same day. So it really does revolutionize Britain, and it makes Britain a lot smaller. The train also meant that everyone's watch was the same. Before the train came, not everybody had the same time, so it may not be 5 o'clock in Manchester when it was 5 o'clock in London. So the train also universalized time. Here's a painting by one of the most famous English artists of all time, Joseph Turner, and it shows this incredible idea of the train and how it's changing society. This is, Joseph Turner was a romantic artist, so in many ways he didn't like industrialization, but at the same time I think he captures the sense of excitement of the industrial age. However, of course, there's a very dark side to industrialization, and that is something that many Victorians are going to write about. In the 1790s, the great poet William Blake talked about dark satanic mills, and that referred to the hideous conditions of factories and the employment of people in dangerous and exhausting jobs. In this painting, you can see that in many ways industrialization scars the land. Here we can see the mining and the quarrying and the destruction of the countryside. Here we see the city turning from a place where people would have small businesses and houses to gigantic factories that are smoking all the time. And the key thing there, of course, is that you move from knowing people at work to going to a factory where there are 1,000 people and not knowing people. So in many ways, the Victorian age was a terrifying and frightening time, especially to those people who worked in factories. In fact, many British people recognized that there were terrible things going on. And in a very, very famous comparison called England and the Darkest Way Out, we are told that in many ways Britain has become like a vast African forest. It's a dark place. The writer refers to it as darkest England, okay? And that we should stop seeing England as some kind of place of light and civilization, because in many ways it had become a kind of jungle. In this case, a brick jungle. Here we can see some genuine pictures of children working in the textile mills. It was a time of intense child labor. There were over 1 million children at one stage working in different jobs in the United Kingdom. These were terribly dangerous jobs. And this was one of the darker sides of Victorian England. And writers like Charles Dickens, who I'm going to talk about a bit later, writes a lot about the social evils of this particular practice. Also, it was a time in which slavery had ended. However, this man over here, Richard Ostler, wrote a very famous letter to the newspaper, to the Leeds Mercury in 1830, in which he talked about children as being treated as worse than black slaves. And this was a very interesting development because it actually challenged and confronted Victorian society, and it made them look at the fact that children were being treated so terribly, denied an education and a youth in this particular way. So I want you to see that although there were lots of social evils in the Victorian era and terrible things were happening, there were also a lot of people, and especially writers, who were showing the public that these terrible things were going on. So the Victorians were very moral, and they were people who were trying to reform society in many cases and make it a better place. These innocent creatures drawl out, unpitied, their short but miserable existence in a place famed for its profession of religious zeal. Now, this is Richard Ostler's letter. I've included this so that you can see Richard Ostler is accusing Victorians of being hypocrites. Hypocrites are people who say one thing but do another. So the Victorians were famous for their religion. But in actual fact, Richard Ostler is showing that as people profess religion, they are treating children barbarically. And so Richard Ostler is very typical of the more liberal side of Victorians who are constantly criticizing society and trying to change things. Perhaps the greatest Victorian writer of all, and someone who many of you will know, is Charles Dickens, famous for many novelists. Charles Dickens is seen as such an interesting man himself, because in books like Oliver Twist, he shows the suffering of children. What makes Charles Dickens so special is that he's not writing from a privileged position of going and watching what happened. He himself suffered child labor and worked in a blacking factory. So when he writes about industrial poverty and when he writes about cruelty at work, etc., he knows exactly what he is talking about. Another famous book that he wrote is Great Expectations, which you may very well encounter on your literary studies. In this particular book, we see the suffering of a young boy trying to be a gentleman. So Charles Dickens, another thing that he shows is how hard it is to move up the social ladder in Victorian times. If you're born the son of a blacksmith and you want to become a gentleman, that's not an easy task. And Dickens is the writer, I think, who shows this the most eloquently. He also wrote a magnificent book called Hard Times, which attacks two targets. Firstly, school teachers like myself. The school teacher in Hard Times is called Mr. Machokum Child. I don't need to tell you what that means. And he also attacks factories and the hideous industrial conditions which exist in England at the time. Now, Dickens hated the way that education was arranged in the Victorian time. He hated it for its harshness. He hated it for its lack of personalization. As you can see from this photograph, the children sit in rows and they have very little space. They have to be very obedient. At the back, you can see the teachers looking extremely severe. Now, in Victorian times, teachers didn't qualify with a degree certificate. They qualified with a cane. So as they qualified to be a teacher, they were given a cane. And that gives you a sense of what Victorian schools were like. Because in the Victorian age, education was expanding very rapidly, but it was very abusive. And you can see here, this is a picture drawn from one of Dickens' novels. And the teacher here is absolutely beating this child half to death. He's not even using a cane. As you can see, he's using a cudgel. In this case, the boy is actually pinned to the wall and he has been caned by a teacher who has a rather sadistic look of glee on his face. So definitely, Victorian education in many ways very unenlightened by today's standards, very brutal. But people like Charles Dickens were reminding the public of this. And throughout this talk, I want to emphasize that what happens in the Victorian age is a real move to the modern society that we know today. Yes, there was a great deal of cruelty, but as I said, there were also a lot of voices asking for reform and change. And so you'll find with corporal punishment that things at the end of the Victorian era in 1901 are not nearly so bad as at the beginning. Now, in Charles Dickens' novel Hard Times, this is a wonderful quote. "Now what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life." This is Mr. Gradgrind speaking. He is an industrial owner. And this was the particular educational philosophy that many Victorians supported. The idea that you just needed to learn a lot of facts, drill these into the kids, beat these into the kids. Now, this is something that I don't think that many of us would support today, but I want you to realize that education at this particular stage was quite new for working class and poorer people. And so they were finding their way. And the first kind of philosophy of education in the Victorian age was this idea that facts were incredibly important and that you needed to drill students. So this philosophy of drilling, teaching, smashing facts in. Stick to the facts, sir, is what Mr. Gradgrind says. Now, as I said earlier, Charles Dickens himself experienced child labor. He'd actually come from a reasonably wealthy family. His father was a naval clerk, but his father was actually a gambler and was very bad with money. And so when Dickens was 9 years old, his father was put into a debtor's jail. In those days, if you got into debt, you actually went to jail. Now, in this picture here, you can see a young Charles Dickens is sitting down and he is in a blacking factory. Now, a blacking factory, like it suggests, is where they made black dyes. And this was an absolutely particularly terrible job because of the stench, the chemicals, the black hands that it gave you. Moreover, in the blacking factory, Charles Dickens, being a little bit of a posh boy, a bit of a little private school boy, what happened to him was that he was viciously bullied by the overseer, by the owners. So Dickens had a lifelong hatred of bullying. And in most of his fiction and his novels, he set about trying to show the evils of bullying, the psychological and physical scarring that this caused. And it was his mission, always in his writing, to highlight abuse and to try and reform society. As I said, I've got to correct myself there. He was actually 11 when he went to the blacking factory, and he earned 5 or 6 shillings a week, which was really peanuts. And that money went towards paying off his father's debts so that his father could come out of prison. Now, in this photograph here, you can see one of the most famous aspects of Victorian society. Because so many people moved from the countryside very rapidly to towns, there was a real lack of accommodation, and this led to overcrowding and slums. At the same time, the Victorians also had a very, very high birth rate. You had a population explosion. And I found that this picture here illustrates perfectly this terrible sense of dirt and overcrowding that you would find in the slum. What made things worse, because there was such a scarcity of accommodation, landlords often charged large amounts of rent for small rooms. So you would often have 16 people living in a 2 up, 2 down. That's 2 rooms below and 2 rooms above. So you would have whole families living together in one bedroom, often sleeping together in one bed, packed together like sardines. Obviously, far from ideal. Perhaps the worst aspect of the Victorian, urban landscape was the presence of cesspools. Now, they had no proper sewage system. So what you would find at the end of the street would be a cesspool like you see here, probably a lot dirtier with all kinds of things floating in there. Now, what was so terrible about this, of course, is that you would have literally hundreds of people using the same cesspool. I don't need to tell you that this kind of huge amount of excrement, etc., is going to produce a huge amount of disease. And that's why the Victorian era actually had huge diseases and epidemics, the most important of which is cholera, which killed tens of thousands of people, and was a disease that is carried by feces in water. And at the time, what made things very much worse is the Victorians didn't really know what caused these diseases. Many of them believed in what they called the miasma theory, which was an idea that gases cause diseases. So they didn't actually realize that these filthy cesspools and these enormous dung heaps that were at the corner of your road, imagine that, were actually spreading infection everywhere. And so very little was done for long periods of time. It was very hard to reform and change society. Very famously, I've included this cartoon over here. The Thames took most of London's sewage. So I don't need to tell you what colour the Thames was and what it looked like. Horrible floating objects in it all of the time here. In this cartoon, which appeared in Punch, which was a Victorian magazine, Father Thames over here is introducing his children. And his children are diphtheria, scrofula, and cholera. And he is introducing them to Britannica, the figure of Britain. So bad was the stink from the Thames, because it was so filled with sewage, that in 1948, the House of Commons had to close because the MPs couldn't stand the stench that came from this horrible sewage from the river. So this was a terrible problem for London and for all British cities. This idea that there was no proper sewage, that hygiene was very poor, that there wasn't a proper understanding of disease, and that nobody in government really was prepared to do anything about it because they didn't see it as the government's job to fix the landscapes of towns. However, the Victorians should be given great credit for inventing two wonderful things. Firstly, toilet paper, and I think we can all be very grateful that we have this today. If you've ever wondered where the word crap comes from, I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that in school, but I'm going to anyway. Thomas Crapper invented two amazing and wonderful things. First of all, toilet paper, as I said. And secondly, perhaps even more importantly, he invented the flush toilet. So the Victorians were aware of the terrible situation of cesspools and the dirt around them. And they did set about fixing things. As you'll see here, 1861 was the time that toilet paper was invented. Again, we should thank the Victorians for this marvelous invention. Here is a picture of one of Thomas Crapper's early toilets, flushing toilets. Again, a wonderful invention. And by the end of the Victorian era, you will recognize something very familiar, which is the toilet seat, that all of us once again can thank the Victorians for being so innovative when it came to toilet matters. Now, something I'm going to touch on very quickly is the fact that most of us see the Victorians as being very squeaky clean and moral. But in fact, there was actually quite a dark side to Victorian society. And this is where the Victorians get their reputation for being terrible hypocrites from. This famous historian here, Stephen Marcus, wrote a book called The Other Victorians, in which he shows that far from the Victorians simply being religious and highly moral people, there was a darker side to their society, which included things like prostitution and human trafficking. Now, if you think that those are modern curses and they've only occurred recently, think again. According to historians, the Victorians were absolutely riddled with these abuses. And I think this is one of the reasons why some people sometimes get very angry with the Victorians. Because as I said, the one side of them is the public face of goodness and this idea of religion and morality and the stiff upper lip. And then there's this hidden side, the other Victorian side. And that is the side that is dark and in many ways highly immoral. It also extended into something that maybe very few of you will know about, which is that the Victorians took a lot of drugs. This was a huge problem because at the time the British Empire was producing most of the world's opium, and they were growing it in India and they were mainly sending it to China. But within England, there was a lot of opium abuse, and opium was put into all kinds of medicines. It was even given to babies to stop them crying. So once again, I wanted to show you, and one of the reasons why I'm touching upon this is one of the books that you might be looking at is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I want you to see that there are two very different Victorian faces. the squeaky clean face, the facade shown to the public face of moral, hard work, dutifulness, etc. And then this darker hidden sphere, which includes things like prostitution, human trafficking, and drug taking, as well as alcohol abuse. Here's a picture of laudanum. Now, laudanum is a derivative from opium. And I just wanted you to see just how many medicines that it was put into, okay? This particular laudanum here is 40% alcohol and has 47 grains of opium. And it was used for colds, stomach aches, toothaches, and headaches. So it really was a medicine, a bit like paracetamol today. And so there were lots of health problems in the Victorian age because people weren't really aware of how terrible drug addiction was. It's very unlikely today that you would go to the doctor and receive opium today. But to the Victorians, it was one of the most common forms of medication. And as I said, it was even used for things like the cough, diarrhea, rheumatism, women's troubles, cardiac disease. So if you had a bad heart, they prescribed you opium. I'm not sure that that is really effective. And delirium, which means fits. Now, I touched upon Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I'm going to say a little bit more now. This wonderful novel is maybe the quintessential Victorian novel. It goes to the heart of Victorian society because it examines the whole idea of Dr. Jekyll, who is this respectable, marvelous, liked and worshipped doctor, and his darker self, who is Mr. Hyde, as you can see in this particular idea. And I think what Stevenson was trying to do was to actually examine and go to the heart of Victorian society and look at the fact that when you have this incredibly moralistic, puritanical public face, there is a darker self, a self driven by appetites and instincts, who is repressed and pushed inside. And in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll discovers a potion which allows that dark self to come out. Of course, in the novel, Mr. Hyde actually physically transforms into a different human being, a more monkey-like man, because another aspect of Victorian society was the idea of Darwinism, Charles Darwin writing about the idea that human beings originally came from apes. And that was something that really frightened Victorians very much. Very interestingly, this is Benjamin Disraeli, who became the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He wrote a novel before he was the Prime Minister called Sybil, or The Two Nations. And in it, Disraeli actually also saw that Britain was becoming increasingly split between two nations, as he called them, the poor and the rich. And what concerned him is that there was no intercourse between these two. They simply didn't really talk to each other or see each other than as servants and masters. And Disraeli argued in this book that they needed to address this huge gulf between the two different social classes and do something about it. In it, he wrote, "Two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets." So he felt not only were they like people from different countries, but it was like they were an alien form of life. And this is really interesting because Disraeli was a conservative, but he saw that the rich and the poor were increasingly polarized and separated. Thought, even though this isn't actually a Victorian photo, it's actually an Edwardian photo, it's taken in 1905, it's one of the most famous photos in England ever taken. In it, you can see two boys. They are wearing the Eton school uniform. Incidentally, students, if you don't know, this is the uniform that Etonians still wear today. They wear a frock coat and a top hat, remarkably. Not much change there. And these boys over here, by today's standards, I think would be considered quite well dressed. But they are wearing more of a working class uniform. And I think why the photo is so famous is this boy is looking at him and he really just is thinking, what on earth is going on here? He doesn't understand them. And if you look at these two chaps over here, they really have the arrogant look of the ruling class. They're doing anything but staring at these ruffians, scruffians here. They're looking ahead because they know that they're a higher species of life. And I think this photo here, in many ways, could be seen as symbolic of what was happening in Victorian times between the classes. Now I'm going to change track a little bit and just talk about the fact that even though the Victorian era in many ways was very harsh and you had industrialization, it was a time of incredible imagination. And many of the most famous fairy stories and fantasy books were written by the Victorians. You may know The Secret Garden, an incredibly famous story by Frances Hodgson Burnett, or you might know Alice in Wonderland. And there are absolutely huge numbers of these books. And one of the reasons why so many fairy tales were written is because the Victorians, at least in posters and officially, worshipped childhood. And they made childhood a special and sacred thing, and they treated it very, very sentimentally. Pears Soap was one of the biggest companies in Victorian England. It still exists today, but obviously it's not nearly as big as it used to be. Invariably, Pears would use pictures of beautiful cherubim, angel-like children. And this is part of the Victorian idea that childhood is so important. So I think that's why they wrote so many stories for children. And there was such an emphasis upon the innocence and the beauty of childhood. The Victorians also extended and in many ways, I think, perfected the Gothic genre. Some of you will have come across the novel Frankenstein, which is written by Mary Shelley in the early 1800s. But Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1891, and Wilkie Collins, who was a good friend of Charles Dickens, was also writing wonderful Gothic novels like The Woman in White. So the Gothic genre was really important to the Victorians. And they also loved Gothic architecture, as I'm going to show you. So they loved ghost stories. They loved stories about the supernatural. So even though it was a very rational and scientific era, there was also a real love of the imagination and of the dark side of the imagination in particular. I think that was partly because the Victorians were so obsessed by crime. And in this picture here, you can see Jack the Ripper. One of the key things of the Victorians was expanding newspapers so that virtually everybody starts to read newspapers. And in general, more people are reading during the Victorian age. As education extends, you get more people reading penny dreadfuls. Those are very small little horror story style books. And they're also reading the media and newspapers. And Jack the Ripper is perhaps the most famous Victorian story, because it is such a blood-curdling story in which you have this terrible killer who seems to have medical training, who murders women and cuts out parts of their organs. Here you can see the actual London Daily Post, the real article that occurred on Jack the Ripper. So people were so excited by these stories and wrote about them ad nauseum. And I think in many ways, this kind of knowledge of crime led to another Victorian invention, which is the bobby or the police force. Originally, the police were called Peelites after Robert Peel, who began them. And the Victorians really should be credited for inventing modern-day policing. They loved the idea of police and detectives, and many stories like Sherlock Holmes and Edgar Allan Poe's stories also about detectives celebrate the idea of catching criminals. So you have this idea of crime in the Victorians, but you also have the beginnings of the detective story and of the modern day police force. And I'm going to change track now and say that the Victorians also saw themselves as futuristic people. Again, I don't think you would see them that way, but in many ways that's how they saw themselves. In 1851, the Crystal Palace was built. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, was the main architect behind this. And they built this giant steel and glass structure. and they took some of the finest technological inventions from around the world and they exhibited them in Crystal Palace. Now, millions of people went to see this and they felt proud to be British. They felt proud of the technology that was in Britain. And this was a celebration of the modern. And this shows the fact that in many ways, the Victorians were very forward-looking, certainly in terms of design and in terms of architecture and technology. Now, one of the key things that was celebrated in the Great Exhibition in 1851 was the British Empire. And it's really, when you go to Britain today, it's hard to understand just how big the British Empire used to be. It was absolutely enormous. And I've included this map here of India because India was what they called the jewel in the crown, the absolute key British colony. And this gave Britain incredible wealth, and it also gave them incredible prestige. The empire continued to expand throughout the Victorian time and was perhaps the most important aspect of Victorian society. Queen Victoria actually became crowned as Empress of India. And that just shows how important India was to the British imagination. This gives you a sense of how diverse and how spread out the British Empire was. Some of you may have heard of the phrase, the sun never sets upon the British Empire. And this shows Britain, this is when America was still part of Britain. Later on, Britain takes over so much here of Africa, lots and lots of Asia, all the way to Australia and New Zealand here. So they have this enormous sweep. And if we actually think here of this rather tiny little island nation here controlling this huge, enormous empire, it is absolutely remarkable. The empire figures a great deal in Victorian literature, and it is both a source of fear because of the idea of strangers, of foreigners, of xenophobia, but it's also a place of opportunity for British people. So many British people who couldn't make it in England left to join the empire and made a fortune in different parts of the world. I've lived in many of Britain's former colonies, in places like Borneo and Malaysia and Singapore and Hong Kong. And all of these places were seen as places of incredible opportunity for young men, not so much for young women. And as you can see here, we have this white woman surrounded by these Indian women. I think it's worth saying that quite often British women who went out to the colonies were very bored and isolated because they had nothing to do, whereas the men at least had jobs to entertain them and to give their lives a sense of purpose. Now, the empire also allowed for this idea of militarism. This idea that Britain was an imperial nation, a tough nation. So I want you to see that actually a great deal of British literature was pro-empire, pro-hunting, going out and taming wild Africa and Asia, and doing this for Britain and for supposedly for a civilizing mission to make the world a safer and a better place. So I've said a number of times today, and I'm going to repeat it now, I want you to see the Victorians as a culture and a time of revolution. In this particular picture I've chosen here, you will see the first car, the first automobile. So I want you to think that in 1830, you have the beginnings of the steam train, very, very basic steam train. And towards the end of the Victorian era, you're starting to get modern roads, you're starting to get modern vehicles. You're getting a world that we can recognize today. Also, I've included this, one of the most remarkable inventions of the Victorians. As early as 1863, they built the underground. They built underground trains. Now, imagine how sci-fi that was in their time. Having trains that were going down beneath you in the depths of London. It's absolutely quite a remarkable piece of engineering. And it just shows how brave the Victorians were and how they were prepared to really challenge all of the conventions in things like engineering and technology, etc. The Victorians also invented the bicycle. Now, maybe they aren't the greatest sort of track bicycles that we might be riding today, but the bicycle also revolutionized people's lives. It allowed them to travel long distances. It allowed them to go to the countryside. I'm also including the camera, photographs. What a remarkable invention that was, that every family could afford at least one photograph of them together. You could capture a moment in time. The telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell. Again, it seemed like an extraordinary invention to hear someone's voice from hundreds of miles away. So the Victorians saw their age as a go-ahead and exciting and technological age. And of course, radio, invented by Marconi, an Italian who was living in Britain at the time. So you have all of this new technology, and really the Victorians simply couldn't keep up with it. We think of ourselves as so high-tech with the internet now, but I think in many ways the Victorians experienced greater change than we do. Here's a picture of the telegraph as well, another extraordinary invention that allows communication over long distances. And I'm coming towards the end of the lecture now. I hope that you found it interesting. I wanted to say that I began by talking about how women had to stay in the home, how they had to support men. And it might seem like Victorian women, therefore, were all victims and they were confined like prisoners to the domestic sphere. But actually, that's far from true. Because by the end of the Victorian age, you have the beginnings of the suffragettes. They are the women who are fighting for the vote. So you have the beginnings of really modern feminism, women fighting for reproduction knowledge, women fighting for education, women fighting for jobs. And as you can see here, perhaps the grandest prize of all, women fighting for political representation in the country. So I'm going to end now by returning to Victoria in 1901. This is a picture of her funeral. It was an extraordinary event in which over 1 million people turned up to watch her coffin being carried across London. It was a time of great sadness for many people because they recognized that it was the end of an era. And I want to emphasize that Queen Victoria's reign shouldn't really be seen as a conservative time. It should be seen as a time of change. And I think many of these people were so sad because they recognized that as Queen Victoria died, that history had moved on and that we had entered the 20th century and that there was going to be a big move forward away from the earlier era and that Britain and the modern world would be in many ways totally unrecognizable to their ancestors. Thank you so much for listening.